This lesson continues studying of Exodus from the celebration after the nation of Israel crosses the Red Sea to when God defeats the Amalekites with Joshua leading the army. So we pick it up here in chapter 15, and the bulk of this chapter is basically a poem, the song that they make up on the spot, as far as I know. And Hebrew poetry tends to be in the form of what they call couplets, where they make a statement and then they repeat it in just different words. And it's kind of, we're used to in English having things rhyme, having the vowels rhyme, but that's not how they did it in Hebrew, especially as evident in the Psalms. But at least for the time being, the point is that Israel is truly worshiping God from their hearts. They just saw a really spectacular miracle, and they went through a sea on dry ground, and the pursuing high-tech army of the time was drowned in the sea. And that's another thing, is that you don't say that people drowned in a marsh, and they don't drop like a rock into the depths of a marsh. So again, as with the other video, that there's just no way this was a sea of reeds. And so that's really the main point of that whole chapter 15. And this is one way, this is what worship really is. And of course, it's not the only way to worship God, but in both testaments, it's clear that God wants to be in what we would think of as a parent-child kind of relationship with us, a family. And that true worship is when our daily lives reflect that relationship and not be fickle like the Israelites will turn out to be and have been already. But as it says in Isaiah 29:13, these people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Right now, everything is good. Their hearts are in it, but that's not always going to be the case. And as Jesus put it in Matthew 15:11, it's not what goes into us that defiles us of what's come out. In the same way, it's not what we do outwardly that is true worship, but where that worship is coming from. And if our hearts are not in it, and we don't live like God matters, it's just empty words and hollow tunes. And that's something we have to be careful of these days, and not, forget to learn these lessons from the Israelites, who would, as even Jesus put it when he was being praised on what's called Palm Sunday, that he knew not to let this go to his head. Not that it would, but that's the phrase, the understanding that he knew that even though they were sincere at the moment, that they would turn on him at the drop of a hat. And so it has been with Israel, but we do the same thing. We don't live like it matters a lot of times. And this kind of brings up a growing problem in Christian worship. The worship team or church leadership in some way imposes its will and taste in music on the congregation. There's been people who said that their worship leader or whoever it was just didn't care what the congregation wanted. They were going to impose the modern whatever it was. And the problem is, how can we join our hearts in worship if the music is grating, or the lyrics are shallow, or the tune is nearly impossible for the average non-musician to sing? When I was much younger, I thought that only Luddites would forbid the use of instruments in worship, but maybe they were onto something, because how many of our worship songs would be singable without instruments? Now, don't get me wrong, even Miriam and all the women here have tambourines in this passage, and they all not only sing but also dance. So I'm not saying, let's all go back to horse and buggy days. But what I think the modern church has done is make participation in worship nearly impossible. Somewhere between the old bringing in the sheaves and the new draw me close, which incidentally most worship music seems to either come from Hillsong or the Newsboys for some reason. But the lyrics, a lot of times, in both of those cases, even the old hymns, the lyrics are like, why are we singing this? This could be sung anywhere at any time. Some people have said that songs like Draw Me Close could be sung in a nightclub and you wouldn't know the difference. It sounds like a love song. And a lot of people have, almost to a sickening level, liken salvation to some kind of dating, like they're almost dating Jesus. And this is just disgusting. But somewhere between those extremes of just sticking to the old 150-year-old hymns that really don't say much either, or the new ones that border on, I don't know what to call it, but somewhere between those two extremes is worship that really honors God and what He has done and will do, rather than what we say we're going to do or how God makes us feel, or some other meaningless work or army song that have all been the ancient church hymns as well. Somewhere between those two extremes is what God really wants from us, and that's our hearts. So, but let's get back to the text and go down to verse 20. And what we see there is that Moses' sister Miriam, she is called a prophet. She's leading the women in worship, but she is no less a prophet than any man would be, and she isn't the only such woman in Scripture. Others would be people like Deborah, the wife of Isaiah, Huldah, the four daughters of Philip in the New Testament. There are female prophets, and I think Deborah especially was saying, "Thus saith the Lord," as any man would, and she lived at the same time as Jeremiah. So God is not scraping the bottom of the barrel to use a woman as a prophet. And Peter said on Pentecost that he quoted Joel and said, "Your sons and daughters will prophesy." And prophesying is not just telling the future, it's speaking to the people on behalf of God, whereas a priest represents people to God. And it doesn't matter anyway, where the point is that God is not a respecter of persons. And the thing is that we need to remember why it is that God has put emphasis on the firstborn males and not females. It's a reminder that Pharaoh tried to murder them, and later Herod would try the same thing. He would kill all the baby boys 2 years and younger in an effort to kill what he considered a future rival to the throne, or governorship or whatever. That's what that's a reminder of. It's not proof that men are more godly or qualified to lead just because of their flesh. And so if a woman is gifted to prophesy, then no one can tell her not to do it. And here we have, even in the Old Testament, women prophesying. And how can this be more restrictive in the New Testament? So that's the point. But we should keep in mind also that through most of history, when we just mentioned that the reason God is singling out firstborn males in these passages, most of history has been baby girls who were killed. Even today, in some Eastern cultures, girls are aborted at a much higher rate than boys. And this is what people do, not what God does or approves. Remember God's habit of choosing the lowly and weak. We dare not despise them, or God himself will avenge. And remember also that not all of God's vengeance will be in this life. As Jesus put it in Matthew 20:16, the last in this life will be the first in the next. So what I'm trying to draw out of this passage is the fact that God is not a respecter of persons, and we shouldn't do that in the church, especially looking at the flesh instead of the heart. And that goes back to the worship issue too, that people should worship because it's coming from within, it's coming from that relationship and not just a performance. So now let's go down to verse 22. And after the celebrations, Moses leads the people into the wilderness, but after 3 days of walking, they find no water. So the fickle and faithless Israelites do what they do best, which is whine and grumble against Moses. And still they get what they demand, a miracle from God through Moses, which God uses to remind them who he is. They seem to need a lot of reminders. This illustrates God's patience and reluctance to punish, which is another lesson for us. But the point is, you can't do that forever, and he won't do that forever. There will be at least 2 times in Israel's history when they were exiled, and yet God always takes back a remnant. We have to remember that in our own time. Just because Israel has been in exile since AD 70 doesn't mean that he's done with them forever, any more than he was done with them when they were exiled to Babylon or Assyria. So this is why we study the Old Testament, so we know what God's habits are and how he has treated Israel. But now let's go down to 16. And shockingly, they get to the next area of wilderness and start complaining again. and saying they'd be better off to die in Egypt, where at least they had pots of meat and all the bread they wanted. They have really short memories. So if we look down here just a little bit farther in verse 4, God says, fine, I'll rain down bread from the sky, but I'm going to test their sincerity in following my rules. So he tells them to gather bread for 6 days, but not on the 7th. So on the 6th, they have to gather twice as much. And Moses points out to the people that it isn't him and Aaron they're complaining against, it's God. And then down in verse 9, God tells Moses to tell Aaron to assemble the people and tell them that God will give them meat in the evening and bread in the morning to show them once again that he's God and they're not. So they are whining and he is doing things for them, but he's also testing them in these things, and they're all lessons. These things happen for reasons. And then we'll go down to verse 13 and see that, as promised, God sends a flock of quail for meat, and the next morning the ground is covered in something they decide to call, what is this? Which is where the word manna comes from. They don't know what it is. What's this stuff? And that's all they could think of to call it. It was kind of whitish and very light and had the taste of honey. But anyway, they collect just what they need for the number of people in their tent or house. They were living in tents because they're traveling, which is a good reminder that what God does with one person is not always what he does with another. We have to remember that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to how God uses people. And then Moses also tells them not to try and save any for the next day, when it's, not the 6th day. On any of the other days, they only gather enough for that day. But of course, some of them don't listen, and the next day the manna has become worm-ridden and smelly. So that's a lesson that God is having to teach them a lot of. Then we go down to verse 22, and the next test comes on the 6th day when they're told to gather twice as much, and it would not go bad the next day. So they've already seen that if you keep it when you're not supposed to, it goes bad. But now they're going to be tested on whether they keep it when they are supposed to. But some people go out the 7th day anyway to try to gather some more. And of course, there isn't any manna to be found. And this is the first use of the word Sabbath, which means rest. That's pretty much all it means. And like the rite of circumcision, it predates the actual Levitical law. So again, some people take this to mean it's a rule for the Gentiles as well to observe the Sabbath. But again, this is for the nation of Israel. It's not given as a command to all nations. There's no evidence that the whole world ever knew to make every 7th day holy to God. They may have had some inkling of that, but we don't have any mandate from the Bible to extend it out to Gentiles. This is all specifically for the nation of Israel. And again, as mentioned in an earlier lesson, when it comes to things that predate the law, we don't hear Christians today mandating circumcision, but they will mandate tithing and Sabbath observance because it's selective. It's just arbitrary. So now let's go down to verse 31. And as a reminder for coming generations, God tells Moses to have Aaron collect a jar full of manna to be preserved. And this manna would be the bread, quote unquote, of Israel for years to come, for all coming generations. And especially, that this reminder would be kept, this jar of it, but throughout their what will be 40 years of wandering, manna will be their staple food, manna and quail. And Constable, the notes that I always put in the description, says that since caravans passed through the areas that they were wandering, the people of Israel certainly traded with them. That's half the reason God probably had them take all that stuff, that loot from the Egyptians. And so they could get other food during that time, but manna was still going to be the main thing that they could count on. And then down in chapter 17, God has Israel move on. And again, they come to a place where there is no potable water or drinkable, usable water. So again, they take it out on Moses. I think there's a pattern here. So God has Moses take the elders to a certain rock, and Moses is told to strike the rock with his staff, which causes water to flow out. I think it's as much a miracle that this stopped the grumbling against them for the time being as that water came out from a rock. I'm not sure which is the bigger miracle. But then as we see down here in verse 8, as if they needed another reason to whine, Israel is now attacked by the army of Amalek. But God has another lesson to teach them. They muster an army, and during the battle, Moses is going to stand on a hilltop with his staff in his hand, and this is where we meet Joshua for the first time. And you'll notice in the Greek text, the name for Joshua is Iesus, or Jesus, more like the Y sound, exactly the same as it's spelled and probably pronounced in the New Testament for Jesus. That's how it's written in the Greek New Testament, Iesous, using English letters for our convenience here. So if people want to, again, I mentioned about the sacred name nonsense on Elohim and Yahweh and things like that before. The same you could do throughout the New Testament. If you're going to do that, do it thoroughly and call everybody by the way it's written in the Greek or the Hebrew equivalent, but people don't do that. They're, again, selective. At any rate, Moses is accompanied on the hilltop by Aaron and someone named Hur, while Joshua leads the army down on the ground there. As long as Moses holds up his hands, presumably to hold up the staff, which was the symbol of royal divine power, Israel prevails in the battle, but the tide turns every time he lowers his hands. So to deal with fatigue, they have Moses sit on a rock while the other two hold up his hands. And clearly, God is winning the battle. Even though the people are actually fighting it, it doesn't go well for them when Moses doesn't hold the staff up, or at least hold his hands up. So if we look down here in verse 14, we see that God tells Moses to write this down as another memorial and have Joshua memorize it, because God will remain the enemy of the Amalekites and eventually wipe out the memory of them from the earth. We will also remind them that, that's kind of seems counterproductive. If you're going to wipe out the memory of them from the earth, yet you want to memorize this so you remember it. That maybe, the remembering is obviously just for the Jews, and the rest of the world will forget there were ever these Amalekites. It will also remind them that the battles they win as a nation are not won by them, and that God will only enable them to win as long as they walk in his ways. And we should note also that Moses wrote the words, since liberal critics claim writing hadn't been invented yet. I have the impression from looking around that the critics are finally abandoning that claim that writing hadn't been invented in the time of Moses. It certainly had, and far before that. All right, now to chapter 18. And at this time, after they've won this battle through God's power with the Amalekites, Moses' father-in-law Jethro reappears, and he brings Moses' wife and sons, and Moses gets them up to date on all the stuff that has happened. And then if we go down a little bit to verse 10, we see that Moses' father-in-law advises him on some things. First of all, though, he praises God and accepts that this God is the one above all others, because Jethro was a priest of Midian, but it doesn't say priest of what God, and certainly the knowledge of the God of Israel wasn't all that widespread. So it's, this just noting in the text that he praises this God. And then the next day, we have to go a little farther to see the rest of that, starting in verse 13. Moses sits down to judge disputes that arise among the Israelites, as seem to be the habit. If you have that many people, up to 2 million or so, you're going to have petty disputes break out, and somebody needs to adjudicate those. And it seems from this verse, we hadn't heard about it before, this passage, that Moses was the judge. He judged everybody, and they stood in line all day waiting for their turn. So Jethro says this is inefficient, it's exhausting, so he advises Moses to only deal directly with issues concerning direct commands from God and the really toughest legal cases, but appoint people of high character and wisdom to handle the day-to-day disputes. And we can see that down in verse 21. And so he follows his advice, and appoints people. And let me go down. I think, yeah, we do have verse 21 there. Moses takes the advice, delegates judging authority to them by tens, fifties, hundreds, and thousands, which a rough equivalent would be like in the U.S. here, we'd have legal issues on a city, county, state, and federal level. Though Israel as yet had not been given a detailed law code or national code, they certainly were familiar with such things because they didn't grow up in a vacuum. They grew up in Egypt. They had a very well-developed legal system, as did a lot of nations at the time. So when people say borrowing, they're trying to presume that Israel was supposed to have been grown, formed in a vacuum and never had any contacts with the outside world. And so when we say that the Bible is authentic and original, that doesn't mean it was done in a vacuum and the people had no contact with the rest of the world. That's just a really this really bad logic and an unfair argument. But at any rate, I think we're going to stop there. That's pretty much the end of chapter 18. And the next lesson, the next chapter, will go on to 19. And this is where we see the beginning, the details of the codified laws of Israel from God. But to end this lesson, let's take a look at Constable's notes on this chapter for a small chart of some uncanny details comparing Melchizedek and Jethro. On the left there, you can see we have Melchizedek that we met back in Genesis, and then Jethro on the right that we met here in chapter 18. Well, we met him before, but about his encounter with Abraham, not Abraham, Moses here. Both were Gentile priests. Both met the chief protagonists at this time. One was, before it was Abraham, this time it's Moses, after they have defeated an army. And they bring gifts of some sort. They were offering some kind of peace offering or blessing. What's really interesting is I think down there where it says Abraham's heir was Eliezer, God is my help, and the same name for Moses' heir. That's his son's name. And it doesn't really say that Moses named his son after him. It's possible, but I just think it's an interesting parallel. And then the second to last one there, Melchizedek praises God for rescuing Abraham from the Amalekites, and Jethro praises God for rescuing Moses from the Egyptians. So, and it's interesting that we've met the Amalekites here again. I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list, but there were Amalekites involved here as well. But of course, the big rescue was from the Egyptians. That's why they were traveling. So, and then when they have the last one there, they have sacrifices. But it's a parallel I hadn't really noticed before, but I'm sure there's lots of those that I haven't noticed. But at any rate, we will end the lesson here, and next time we will get more into the law.